On what should have been a quiet celebration of Prince William's 43rd birthday, the world was blindsided by a royal bombshell. The air around Kensington Palace felt deceptively serene, gardens in bloom, staff moving about in quiet routine, and no sign of what was about to erupt behind those well-guarded walls. Birthdays for senior royals often follow a predictable script. A new portrait, perhaps, a short statement of gratitude, or maybe a family photo circulated through royal channels, but this time nothing felt ordinary. Something beneath the surface had shifted, and for those who knew how to read the royal temperature, the silence said everything. For weeks leading up to the day, subtle signs had begun to stir whispers inside the palace. It wasn't just the rearranged schedules or the abrupt changes in staffing assignments. It was the sharpness with which orders were being issued, and the quiet dread that seemed to grip certain corridors of royal communication. Those closest to the palace machinery noticed an unusual increase in private meetings between Prince William and senior aides, with doors closed tighter than usual, and mobile devices strictly kept outside. Something was brewing. Everyone sensed it, but no one could predict the storm it would become. The press, often dismissed as outsiders, had caught the scent too. Select journalists were discreetly tipped off to keep their eyes open around the Prince of Wales' birthday. Still, the media remained unprepared for the sheer weight of what would be revealed, because this wasn't just a ceremonial shuffle or a new charity endorsement. It was a seismic jolt to the structure of the monarchy, a move so swift and silent that it stunned even those who thought they had seen everything. By mid-afternoon, the calm shattered. In a curt and shockingly brief statement issued through official palace channels, the public learned that James, Earl of Wessex, and Lady Louise Windsor, grandchildren of the late Queen Elizabeth II, would no longer be using their royal courtesy titles. The change was effective immediately. There was no lead-up, no public discussion, no dramatic fallout, just a single explosive declaration that left royal watchers scrambling and insiders reeling. What made the moment even more unsettling was who delivered it. Although the announcement bore the seal of King Charles III, the fingerprints of Prince William were unmistakably all over it. For those familiar with recent palace dynamics, it was clear. This was William's idea, William's initiative, and William's assertion of power. On the surface, it appeared administratively a quiet reorganization of roles, but beneath that facade lay a far deeper truth. This was Prince William stepping out of the shadows, not just preparing to become king someday, but beginning to rule in his own right today. This wasn't the traditional royal birthday celebration of grace and gratitude. It was a declaration of dominance, and for the monarchy, it was a line drawn in stone. Because titles like Earl of Wessex and Lady Louise don't just disappear quietly, they carry decades of legacy, symbolism, and bloodline. And to erase them so unceremoniously was not just a rebranding, it was a purge. But what drove this unprecedented move, and why were these two seemingly innocent royals at the center of it all? The king's name was on the paper, but the hand guiding the pen was William's. Behind the elegant formality of the royal decree lay a silent revolution. On the surface, it was Charles III's command, executed through official channels with the weight of tradition behind it. But those within the palace knew better. This wasn't a command from a weary monarch clinging to custom. This was the calculated will of a future king, rewriting the rules of the monarchy, one title at a time. Prince William, once known for his dutiful waves and polished appearances, had stepped into a role far more consequential than his public image suggested. Quietly, almost invisibly, he had crossed a threshold, no longer simply the heir, but the architect. For years, William played the part expected of him, a loyal son, a smiling prince, a ceremonial figurehead. But something changed when Charles ascended to the throne. The transfer of power wasn't instant or dramatic. It was subtle, strategic, and deeply intentional. William began absorbing responsibilities once reserved for the monarch himself, taking meetings once chaired by his father, steering conversations about the monarchy's shape, tone, and function. And as Charles's health subtly waned, William's influence rose. He began to mold not only the image, but the internal structure of the crown, replacing outdated formality with sharp-eyed reform. Stripping James and Louise of their titles wasn't an isolated decision. It was the opening act in William's larger campaign. The monarchy, in his view, was no longer a sacred inheritance. It was an institution that needed reshaping, pruning, and modernizing. With one swift stroke, 2 royal titles were erased, not as an act of discipline, but as a signal that the days of ornamental royals lingering on the edges of significance were over. A moment forward, every name, every title, every symbol would carry weight and purpose. Inside palace walls, this wasn't news. It was confirmation. William had already begun reorganizing staffing structures, reducing unnecessary expenses, and rethinking the role of extended family members. He met with senior officials not to discuss tradition, but strategy. The monarchy, in his vision, would be smaller, sharper, and more aligned with public values. In private, he spoke of transparency, accountability, and, most of all, relevance. The quiet removal of James and Louise's titles wasn't punitive, it was surgical. It was deliberate. It was how revolutions happen behind castle doors, not with banners and speeches, but with signatures and silences. William didn't need the crown to wield power. He didn't need fanfare to send tremors through centuries of royal legacy. His power wasn't loud, it was precise. And while the public processed the news as a shocking twist, insiders knew it was just the beginning. William had made it clear, this monarchy would not be inherited, it would be redefined. And at the heart of this seismic shift stood 2 young royals raised in silence, now thrust into the spotlight. For years, they walked quietly in the shadow of the crown until the crown turned its back. James and Louise, the soft-spoken children of Prince Edward and Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, were never meant to become headlines. They were the kind of royals whose names barely surfaced in conversations about succession, scandal, or ceremony. But perhaps that was the point. From the beginning, their lives were sculpted around silence, privacy, and quiet dignity. Their parents, determined to protect them from the pressures of royal performance, made a choice that now feels both prescient and tragic. They kept them away from the limelight, away from titles that would shackle them to a life they never chose. Unlike their cousins who were born into royal duties and groomed for global attention, James and Louise were allowed something rare in royal circles, a childhood. They attended ordinary schools, mingled with ordinary peers, and faced the world without the weight of a crown pressing down on their names. Technically, they had the right to be called prince and princess, but their parents, in a bold departure from royal protocol, rejected that entitlement. It was a decision praised at the time, a progressive nod to modern parenting within a famously traditional institution, and for years it worked. The world didn't ask much of them, and they asked little from the world in return. Louise, the elder of the 2, quietly earned admiration from those who paid attention, thoughtful, reserved, and often seen assisting her grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, during events at Balmoral. She embodied an old-world poise that rarely makes headlines, but deeply moves those who witness it. Her bond with the late Queen was genuine, built not on obligation, but affection. Family members recalled their long walks and unspoken understanding. Louise was the granddaughter who never sought the spotlight, but always showed up when it mattered. James, her younger brother, followed a similar path. Always well-mannered, always composed, he avoided the camera flashes with the same quiet ease. For a brief moment, It seemed the royal establishment had finally acknowledged his coming of age when he was named Earl of Wessex, following his father's elevation to Duke of Edinburgh. It was a symbolic gesture, nothing legally binding but rich in tradition. And yet scarcely a year later, that symbol was stripped away. No scandal, no impropriety, no controversy, just silence. Titles that once adorned their identities were erased as swiftly as they were bestowed. This wasn't punishment, it was a procedure at least. That's how it was presented. Procedures have consequences. For James and Louise, this wasn't just about losing titles, it was about losing a legacy that, while not fully embraced, still defined who they were. Stripped of the very symbols that once tethered them to royal heritage, they now face a new identity, one detached from ceremony, but no less marked by history. Yet behind this institutional reform was a mother's heartbreak and a legacy suddenly rewritten. She gave her children the freedom of anonymity, and the monarchy took even that. For Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, the royal titles stripped from her children weren't just ceremonial shifts. They were wounds cut deep into the fabric of a life she had spent decades carefully weaving. She wasn't born into this world of crowns and courtiers. She entered it by choice, carving her place beside Prince Edward, not through entitlement, but through quiet strength and unwavering dedication. But now she stood watching everything she had fiercely protected unravel in a decision she didn't make, couldn't stop, and wasn't even consulted on. Her silence has been dignified, but it is the silence of heartbreak, not indifference. Her bond with Queen Elizabeth II had been one of the strongest in the entire royal family. More than just duty, theirs was a relationship built on mutual trust and shared values. They were often seen together in the Queen's final years, walking through Windsor's private paths, speaking quietly in drawing rooms, and sharing the kind of closeness rarely found in royal dynamics. The Queen trusted Sophie, not just as a daughter-in-law, but as a moral anchor in an institution that had weathered too many storms. Sophie, in return, modeled her motherhood on that same quiet resilience. She wanted her children to be free to grow, to stumble, to succeed without headlines documenting every move. And that meant shielding them from titles too heavy for young shoulders. She and Edward agreed their children would not be prince or princess unless they chose to claim those titles as adults. It was a radical departure from royal tradition, but it was their stand, a promise to raise James and Louise as people first, royals second. For years, the plan worked. The children enjoyed their privacy, lived largely out of public view, and built identities beyond the palace walls. And then, in one swift motion, that future choice was taken from them. The right to decide for themselves to step into royal roles or remain private citizens was erased. Not because of the scandal, not because of failure, but because the system they belonged to decided their names no longer fit within its evolving frame. And so Sophie watched as her son lost a title he had only just inherited. Watched as her daughter, now a university student, was pushed further from the royal fold. She said nothing publicly. There was no statement of outrage, no interview, no subtle retaliation. But those close to the palace speak of a sadness in Sophie that's impossible to miss. A quiet mourning, not just for her children's stripped identities, but for the rupture of a promise she once believed the monarchy would uphold. A monarchy she served with loyalty, dignity, and grace. Now she stands on unfamiliar ground, one where her sacrifices feel overlooked, her decisions undone, and her loyalty tested. Sophie had built her royal life carefully, brick by brick, with a sense of balance few have mastered in royal circles. She was the working duchess who showed up, who cared, who connected. And yet, in this new chapter being authored under William's watchful eye, her voice, like her children's titles, was quietly removed from the conversation. It wasn't betrayal, but it was abandonment by tradition. A monarchy moving forward, but not always taking care of those it leaves behind. But Sophie wasn't the only one affected. Prince Edward II was caught in a tide of change that seemed to erase his family's place in royal tradition. He waited 20 years for the Duke of Edinburgh title, only to watch his children lose theirs. For Prince Edward, the youngest of Queen Elizabeth II's children, the honor of finally receiving the title his late father once bore was meant to be the closing chapter in a quiet life of service. He had never chased power. He had never courted controversy. While his siblings drew the public's attention with their drama and defiance, Edward stayed the course, loyal, consistent, and often overlooked. So when the crown finally bestowed the Duke of Edinburgh title upon him, it felt less like a reward and more like a recognition long overdue. And then barely months later came the blow. His son James was stripped of the very title that symbolically tied their family line together. What had once felt like a legacy secured, now felt like a legacy erased. For a man who had kept himself distant from palace politics, this move felt personal. The title of Earl of Wessex, passed ceremoniously to James after Edward's elevation, wasn't just a name. It was a signal that the family's continuity would remain intact, that their quiet branch of the monarchy still had a place in the grand design. But William's sweeping reform didn't spare sentiment. In one move, he not only dissolved the title, but cut through years of delicate family balance. It was a calculated shift, designed to streamline the monarchy, but its impact was devastatingly symbolic. Edward, whose entire royal life had been defined by restraint and duty, now found his legacy slipping through his fingers. Behind the walls of Buckingham and Windsor, whispers grew louder. Tensions between Edward and William, once dismissed as unlikely, now simmered beneath the surface. There were no public confrontations, no statements of opposition, but the frost in the air was palpable. Insiders spoke of meetings that felt more formal than familial, of decisions made without consultation, of courtesies skipped. William, now surrounded by a younger, more strategic circle of advisers, was charging forward with his vision of a slimmed-down monarchy. And in that new order, even Edward the Queen's most dutiful son was expendable. For many within the institution, Edward remained a symbol of stability. He was the last living thread to Queen Elizabeth's inner circle, a remnant of a royal philosophy rooted in quiet service rather than public dominance. But in William's version of the crown, symbolism wasn't enough. Practicality ruled, and efficiency trumped tradition. The emotional cost? An afterthought. Edward's discomfort, though never voiced, echoed through the palace halls. He hadn't asked for power, only for place. And now, even that seemed to be slipping away. This was no longer a monarchy of inheritance. It was becoming one of function, optics, and relevance. And for Edward, that shift was a reckoning. A man who had spent his life avoiding the headlines now found himself written out of the narrative, not by scandal, but by strategy. And this wasn't just a private matter. Soon the entire world would weigh in. It began as whispers inside. The palace exploded across the globe within hours. One moment, royal insiders were quietly murmuring about title adjustments behind closed doors. The next, front pages were ablaze with one headline: Prince William had drawn blood within his own family, and the fallout was unstoppable. The quiet, restrained atmosphere of his 43rd birthday was obliterated by the magnitude of what followed. It was no longer a family decision. It had become a public spectacle. The removal of James and Louise's titles, which had been executed with clinical precision, ignited a firestorm. The palace could neither control nor contain. Major media outlets pounced, dissecting every word of the terse announcement with surgical intensity. Speculation outpaced facts at a blistering pace. Was this a message to the extended royal family, a symbolic purge, or a subtle retaliation rooted in old grievances? Nobody knew the full truth, but that didn't stop the floodgates from bursting. Newspapers spun narratives overnight, each one more dramatic than the last. Some painted William as a visionary leader, willing to do what previous heirs couldn't. Others framed him as ruthless, severing even the most harmless branches of the family tree to prove a point. And for once, the palace wasn't steering the story. It was being swallowed by it. Social media was merciless. In minutes, hashtags stormed through Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Users split into factions, those who cheered William for modernizing the monarchy, and those who condemned him for humiliating two young, blameless royals. Millennials, many disillusioned by monarchy as a concept, praised the decision as long overdue. To them, royal titles were outdated relics, and slimming the institution was a step toward relevance. But for older generations, the move felt cold, calculated, and almost cruel. They remembered James and Louise as the shy, respectful grandchildren of Queen Elizabeth II, hardly deserving of such a public exile. And amidst this digital chaos, public sympathy began to crystallize, not around William, but around the ones left behind. Images of Sophie, Louise, and James began circulating. Old footage of Louise assisting the Queen at Balmoral. Snippets of James at royal events, barely speaking, always composed. They became symbols of quiet dignity in a system that had suddenly turned unrecognizable. Comment sections filled with grief, anger, and questions that no palace statement could silence. People weren't just questioning William's decision, they were questioning the institution's soul. Inside the palace, damage control mode kicked in. The PR team, blindsided by the backlash, scrambled to reframe the move. Carefully worded press briefings were dispatched, insisting this was a forward-looking reform, not a personal blow. Future-focused. They repeated a phrase meant to sound visionary, but one that rang hollow for those watching a mother's dreams and two siblings' identities, stripped away in the name of progress. The crown had wanted clarity and control. Instead, it now faced a crisis of perception. The strategy may have been silent, but the consequences were deafening. Questions and critics alike were asking the same haunting question. What had James and Louise done to deserve this? And more pointedly, why had William chosen this moment, this method, and these two? But the question still lingered. Why them, and why now? They were the perfect royals for a modern purge, quiet, innocent, and invisible. In a monarchy increasingly defined by scrutiny and spending, James and Louise Windsor became the collateral damage of a new royal blueprint. They didn't ask for prominence, they didn't chase the public eye, but their silence, their lack of public role, made them ideal targets for a decision designed to send a message. Prince William, now operating with precision more akin to a statesman than a ceremonial figure, wasn't just trimming the edges of the royal family. He was carving out a new shape altogether, leaner, sharper, and far less forgiving. The goal was simple, yet seismic, a smaller, cost-effective monarchy that reflected modern values. For years, the royal family has been walking a tightrope between tradition and public accountability. The costs of palaces, protection, and pageantry are no longer accepted as unquestioned entitlements. With growing pressure from taxpayers and shifting public opinion, William has begun executing a strategy that reframes the monarchy not as a family business, but as a streamlined institution of service. And in that model, titles are no longer tokens of birthright, they're job titles. If you don't work for the crown, you don't wear the badge. James and Louise, despite their royal lineage, had no official duties. They weren't part of the senior working royal circuit. They didn't cut ribbons, give speeches, or represent the monarchy abroad. Their roles, if one could even call them that, were symbolic, rooted in history, not function. And in William's eyes, symbolism without purpose was a liability. By removing their titles, he wasn't stripping them of identity. He was defining the institution's future. Titles under his reign would have to mean something more than inherited status. They would require service, sacrifice, visibility, and accountability. It was a calculated sacrifice. James and Louise weren't controversial figures. They weren't involved in scandals. Their removal wouldn't trigger mass outrage, but it would trigger attention. And that's exactly what it did. The world watched as William drew a hard line, not against enemies, but against excess. The message was unmistakable. Even family is subject to reform. No one, not even the Queen's grandchildren, would be immune to this recalibration of the royal ecosystem. It was both a warning and a vision power, stripped of sentiment, executed in silence. What appeared on paper as a small administrative adjustment was, in reality, a bold redefinition of monarchy itself. By removing courtesy titles from two of the most discreet royals, William proved he was willing to begin this transformation not at the fringes, but within his own bloodline. He didn't need a public feud to justify change. He needed clarity. And James and Louise, untainted by controversy, became the proof that reform could be surgical, not scandalous. But William's campaign didn't start with them. It's part of a longer, calculated plan that's already reshaping the crown. Behind the throne stands a new power circle, young, strategic, and relentless. It is not the traditional court of dukes and lords in velvet halls. It is something far more efficient, far more dangerous to tradition. Prince William's rise has not been defined by coronation or ceremony, but by the quiet ascension of a new kind of leadership, one driven by data, optics, and the kind of cold pragmatism that leaves no room for sentiment. At its core lies a group of modern minds shaping the monarchy from within. They don't wear robes. They don't bow to formality. They manage narratives, influence headlines, and execute reforms before most even know they are in motion. This is William's shadow court, an invisible hand guiding the future of the crown with surgical precision. Gone are the days of bloated royal households echoing with ritual. Those inner circle runs lean, quick, and targeted. The advisors around him are less obsessed with tradition and more focused on relevance. Media specialists, strategic consultants, and forward-thinking aides have replaced the old guard. These aren't gatekeepers to protocol, they are architects of perception. Every move William makes is calculated not only in consequence, but in timing. Whether it's a title being removed, a photo being released, or a family event being attended or skipped, there's a pattern, a strategy, a message, and it always begins from within this inner sanctum of influence. Their philosophy is clear: less ceremony, more control. This isn't about dismantling the monarchy, it's about tightening its grip by reshaping its image. And William, once seen as a restrained successor, is now directing this transformation with the authority of a sovereign in waiting. He may not wear the crown yet, but his hand is firmly on the wheel. While appearances, he decides who shows up. Protocol decisions, he leads the conversation. Titles, statements, seating charts, public communications, all curated and controlled by a man who knows his reign has already begun in practice, if not in name. And this shadow court doesn't crave public validation. It doesn't hold press briefings or claim credit. It thrives in silence, preferring to let the media speculate while it moves on to the next phase. When James and Louise were stripped of their titles, there was no public warning, no drawn-out debate. It was swift, quiet, impeccably timed. That's the mark of William's new court. Minimize the noise, maximize the effect. And behind every headline that catches the world by surprise, there's a carefully orchestrated silence that preceded it. What we're witnessing is not just the evolution of a prince into a king. It's the birth of a new monarchy, forged not in tradition, but in strategy. A monarchy that no longer waits to react, but acts preemptively. William is redefining the throne long before sitting on it, reshaping the family and the institution from the inside out. And if you thought James and Louise were the last, think again. If this could happen to Edward's children, what's stopping it from reaching Beatrice, Eugenie, or even Harry's kids? That's the question now, circling not just royal watchers, but the monarchy itself. The removal of James and Louise's titles didn't just send a message, it drew a boundary. A new rule book is being written, one that no longer prioritizes proximity to the throne, but proximity to purpose. And in this version of the monarchy, blood alone is no longer enough. Titles must be earned, roles must be justified. And legacy? It's being reshaped before our very eyes. For Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, the daughters of Prince Andrew, the shadow of change looms large. Though they still hold their titles, their roles have long existed in a gray area. Not quite working royals, not fully private citizens. They've attended events, supported causes, but haven't carried the institutional weight of duty that the new monarchy now demands. If William's vision holds, even their lineage might not shield them from reassessment. It's no longer about who you are, but what you do. And the slow, methodical tightening of royal ranks suggests that decisions regarding them may already be on the horizon. This isn't just about the adults. The younger generation children of royals born into what was once guaranteed prestige now face a far more uncertain future. The days of being born with a title and assuming it would define one's life are over. Under William's philosophy, that royal birthright is merely a footnote, unless it's matched with public duty. For the children of Harry and Meghan, already navigating a complicated dynamic with the crown, the precedent set by James and Louise speaks volumes. Even within the heart of the family, the rules are shifting. No one is untouched. What we're witnessing is a monarchy morphing from institution to organization. William is crafting something smaller, tighter, and far more accountable. The grandeur may remain, but it's now underscored by a demand for purpose. Every title must mean something. Every appearance must justify its cost. There's no longer room for symbolic roles or honorary placements in a new structure that answers directly to public scrutiny and modern sensibilities. William isn't just modernizing the monarchy, he's fortifying it, cutting away the excess, streamlining the structure, and turning it into something that functions, not floats. And as the line between royal and civilian continues to blur, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't a passing phase. It's a generational shift, a recalibration of an ancient institution. Not with fanfare, but with quiet, relentless intent. Titles may still glitter, but they no longer guarantee significance. They must be lived, not merely worn. As William steps further into power, one thing is certain: the monarchy he inherits won't be the one he grew up in. And for better or worse, that change has already begun. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.